Good afternoon to our viewers in Germany and good morning to our viewers in the United States. I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany, and I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Today is International Women's Day, and we thought that we would take a closer look at Germany's feminist foreign policy. The notion of a feminist foreign policy is nothing new, but just last week it was back in the headlines because the German Federal Foreign Office released its framework for a feminist foreign policy. On that occasion, Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock and Economic Cooperation and Development Minister Svenja Schulze gave a joint statement saying that more equal societies suffer less from hunger and poverty and are therefore more stable as part of the motivation for a more feminist foreign policy. To help us get a better understanding of what feminist foreign policy means and how feminist it really is, we're joined by Barbara Mittelhammer. She is a Berlin-based independent consultant and political analyst who focuses on feminist foreign policy, but also on human security, as well as gender in peace and security issues. Barbara, herzlich willkommen. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So over the past year or so, my colleagues and I have asked a number of German foreign policy experts to define feminist foreign policy, and we've gotten all sorts of different responses depending on who the people were that we were talking to. Some of them were from the foreign ministry, some of them were outside of the foreign ministry. Just as sort of a starting point for us, in a nutshell, how would you define Germany's feminist foreign policy?
That's an interesting tweak to the question, because how do I define feminist foreign policy might not be the same as how I define or how Germany defines its feminist foreign policy, but maybe we can go into that nitty-gritty later. So I would say feminist foreign policy is first and foremost a foreign policy that centers human security. So it takes the individual's point of reference for policy making and thinking, not state security or stability as conventionally defined. It's a human rights approach that mostly and importantly acknowledges that the rights and the perspectives of marginalized groups, those including almost 50% or 50% of the population being women, have been excluded from policymaking and thinking. And feminist foreign policy has a clear intention to change that. Not only because it's a value-based or a human rights approach, but also because it's in the interest and to the benefit of everybody. Because as we know, diversity leads to more just, more effective, and more sustainable outcomes for everybody. I mean, that's something that we know not only from focusing on foreign policy, but also from the corporate sector, for example. And yeah, I think that's basically why what feminist foreign policy is in essence to me, and also in large part to how the Foreign Office has defined it in its guidelines.
Mm-hmm. So perhaps related to that, and as we sort of dig in a little bit, Angela Merkel served as chancellor for 16 years. She was reluctant to focus on feminism and on gender, and just sort of was very sachlich, sort of very matter of fact about the fact that she was a woman leader. And it wasn't until the current coalition government took office in late 2021 that gender issues were really sort of in the forefront of politics. Olaf Scholz insisted on gender parity in his cabinet. The notion of a feminist foreign policy was anchored in the coalition agreement. Do you think that the introduction of this feminist foreign policy in Germany also has something to do with the transition from a more conservative government to the current center-left government with the three parties?
Well, I would certainly say it does, because even though there are elements of feminist foreign policy that I'm sure all democratic parties in the German parliament would agree with, there are certain distinctive markers and a certain emphasis that leads to this more progressive government now that has introduced a feminist foreign policy as its policy, as one of its policy goals in the coalition treaty, and now with 1 year ago, or a little bit over a year ago, and now with the definition of the guidelines, as you said in the introduction, in the middle of last week. And I mean, you have mentioned Angela Merkel, and of course, visibility and representation matters a lot. And I think to many Germans, or maybe also internationally, it's kind of it's a little bit befuddling even to see an all male constellation if you see the chancellor and the two vice chancellors now. And I think it's a good moment whenever you realize that maybe it's strange to see only men at this kind of center of power, and that's certainly something that Angela Merkel contributed to. But there are certain elements, such as, for example, with one thing comes to mind, which is the focus on sexual health and reproductive rights, bodily autonomy, where also the former government, being more conservative, has failed to kind of progress, let's say it like that, in the norm development, and where we can also see that this government has really done its part already and are really trying to work on it. And in parallel to how the German discourse has evolved, you have also, of course, the international development of feminist foreign policy as a governmental framework that has been that has been implemented for several years now. By now there are 8 countries, I would say, that pursue a feminist foreign policy in this name. So we maybe all know it started with Sweden in 2014. And they unfortunately, at the end of last year, decided to kind of cancel at least the terminology, and it's disputed the extent to which they are also kind of regressing in how feminist and how gender equal their approach to foreign policy is. We can also discuss that later if it's a question. But I mean, there are by now 8 countries that are pursuing feminist foreign policy, and we now see it works. And it is something that has been at the beginning maybe belittled or even laughed at. And now we see that there are concrete policy goals and concrete added values and concrete benefits that come out of it. And I mean, something that is at this point in time just not deniable is that we know and that we can literally see that women's rights are somewhat the canary in the mine, so to say. Foreign Minister Baerbock, for example, has put it in the foreword of the Foreign Office's guidelines to feminist foreign policy. She said that women's rights are the barometer of the state of our societies. In that, and you also said that, we know that the more gender equal and the more inclusive a society is, the more peaceful, the more prosperous, and the more stable it also is. So it's really an issue of peace and security, and this is something that comes more and more to attention, as it should.
Mm-hmm. And I'd like to, in the course of our conversation, come back to this notion of women's rights as a barometer for how a society is going and what some of the issues are in that society. And I think we'll be able to get into that. But first, can you remind us all which countries are the 8 countries that are pursuing a feminist foreign policy, and whether there are big distinctions between how any of them are pursuing it, or whether it tends to be a fairly similar approach in each of those countries?
Sure. I mean, I've mentioned Sweden, and
right.
Yeah, they have in 2014 kind of defined the gold standard, maybe you could say it like that, and what a feminist foreign policy as a governmental approach could look like, and how they put it back then. And even though they regressed their approach, and just to explain it because it's really a foundation for how many other countries are doing it. They referred to feminist foreign policy as the framework of the 3 R's. So the issue of rights, and meaning human rights, women's rights, and the rights of everybody. The issue on the dimension of representation, in terms of gender equal, but also inclusive and diverse representation. And the issue of resources, meaning how resources are distributed, but also how the access to resources is actually look like. That could be financial resources, but it can also be information, for example, other types of capabilities. And outlining those three R's in the sense that every foreign policy decision-making process should kind of be assessed by the extent to which they contribute or uphold those three elements. And so this framework, as the 3R, is something that has been established as also one of the most comprehensive implementations of feminist foreign policy. And by now, we also have, one of the earlier countries that pursued similar approaches were France and Canada. France, for example, put forth to have a feminist diplomacy. Still kind of defining a little bit the extent to which they might also now pursue a feminist foreign policy in a more comprehensive manner. Canada has, in 2018, if I'm not mistaken, but also quite some time ago by now, defined that they started with the feminist international cooperation policy, and that logically transgressed to other policy sectors and areas. So then they continued to look at external trade, and they were kind of those spillover effects where you could see that it would just make sense to go further than the international development cooperation. And now you also have the Netherlands, for example, you have Spain, Luxembourg, Mexico, and Chile, who have put forth those agendas to a varying degree. Some of the countries are focusing to a stronger extent on domestic aspects. So, for example, Mexico is looking a lot at how they implement foreign policy or how foreign policy is made at home. And they put great emphasis on that as well. So I think those are very interesting levels where you could see how different you can also apply a feminist foreign policy approach. And that's also, part of the domestic debate, part of the domestic policy culture. Maybe that's something that's included there as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that explanation, and also, thank you for mentioning earlier that feminist foreign policy really takes an individual perspective and not a nation state perspective, because that's a very important sort of different lens to be looking through when thinking about foreign policy. And I guess one of the criticisms, that's been circulating for a while, and certainly that came up again last week after the guidelines were announced and presented, was sort of a criticism of not being too moralistic, if you will, not moralizing to others. And the distinction was sort of made that maybe we shouldn't be thinking in terms of a feminist foreign policy, but rather a values-oriented foreign policy that focuses on the individual as well. How do you see feminist foreign policy sort of differing from a values-oriented foreign policy, or is it? It's very inclusive to begin with, but where do you see distinctions between the two?
Well, I would say that a feminist foreign policy is value-based, of course, because it's a human rights-based approach, but it also opens up these portraying values and interests as opposites. Because in kind of how feminist foreign policy can be applied, they are not, but actually feminist foreign policy is really and truly a realist approach. And that was, I think, the feminist researcher Valerie Hudson, who put it like the realist turn in foreign policy making that we actually need to do, because that's the approach in feminist foreign policy being that it's about taking the complexities of reality into account. So it's not really about being moralistic or moralizing or kind of pointing fingers towards other countries, but it's about reflecting how foreign policy is made at home, basically, and changing kind of the structures of that. So what I said earlier in the beginning, it's about acknowledging that crucial perspectives are missing to the debate and bringing them in by, for example, including gender analyses, by including intersectional analysis, to actually being able to take into account what is important and what kind of aspects are maybe missing to the debate. So, for example, making it a bit more concrete, I mean, we know that gender equality is the strongest indicator for peace and security. So the more peaceful, the more gender equal a given society is, the more peaceful it is internally, but also externally. And we did not, for example, take that into account, looking at the deterioration of women's rights and also the situation of LGBTQ community, for example, when we look at Russia. And I think we need to take those factors of that we know are kind of clear indicators of how a hard security situation is going to evolve into account when we discuss about and think about our foreign policy thinking and planning and strategic foresight, for example. Mm-hmm. And we don't really do that as of now, and we should be doing it because it's really evidence that we can make use of to make better foreign policy and to make foreign policy that contributes to sustainable peace and security after all. And maybe one aspect that's making it a bit more broader in the end again is also the factor of how we perceive security threats. So peace and security, but also war and insecurities affect different people differently. And if we don't, for example, only, in parentheses, only focus on state stability, but on the security of individuals, we realize that it's mostly women, for example, not mostly, but women are disproportionately affected, for example, by the impact of the climate crisis. Just to name one example. So if we look at security threats for individual women in certain contexts, then the climate crisis becomes an even bigger security threat to all of us. And I think that highlights how a feminist approach also supports us in including different kind of security threats that, in my opinion, we should be taking into account.
So I mean, I think that's a very important point. It was interesting reading through the guidelines, and there's an opening sort of letter from Foreign Minister Baerbock, who unequivocally states we need a feminist foreign policy because it's absolutely necessary. And I think for many of the reasons that you were just touching on, it's no wonder that it was Foreign Minister Baerbock, but also Development Minister Schulze, who sort of announced and presented the guidelines, because so much of the foreign policy direction has to do with a redefinition of security and development concerns, right? So the issues that you were talking about related to climate, but then also just access to food and to healthcare and to education. Not having those things puts you at a disadvantage, and as you say, women are often disproportionately disadvantaged in not having access to these things, and that can create instability. So it has to do with sort of a broader definition of security in a way that's maybe not sort of the traditional foreign policy and national security definition. So right.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just going to add something because I realized that the examples that I was giving that I have been giving are, and the debate that kind of is also a challenge in the debate, they are oftentimes looking at how women are vulnerable and how women are impacted by threats and how we need to protect them. But it's also women as agents of peace, or not only women, but also other marginalized groups as agents of peace, because they play a different role in a society, because they have different access in a society, that we need to take that into account. And it's also looking at, again, this very narrow definition of security and maybe defense, or, for example, counterterrorism strategies. If we don't also look at the gender aspect, we lose a huge group of people that can provide us access, but that can also offer threats, basically. So if we dismiss women as agents, then we're kind of completely blind on one eye, so to say. And we know that that's really an impediment.
So let's come. I mean, you've helped us make it a little bit more tangible, but let's come back to sort of this issue of implementation. And it seems to me that there are at least two levels, right? One is, and this is how the guidelines sort of approach it. One level is internally in Germany, but the other is externally in terms of foreign policy and having a footprint abroad. Internally, if one goes through the guidelines, it's clear that the German Foreign Ministry is going to work very, very hard to integrate more women into the Foreign Service and to increase the proportion of women in senior roles, right? That's a very important aspect. Externally, it looks as if much more of Germany's development funds will go to projects that focus on gender equality as their main goal, and even more funding for gender equity as a secondary goal, bringing up levels from previous years. Can you maybe share with us a little bit more how you see feminist foreign policy really becoming even more tangible, both within government structures in Berlin, but then also in how Germany sort of approaches problems and challenges abroad? And then, after that, we can get into some specifics, because there are a couple of countries that I'd like to look at in a little bit more detail that might make it even more tangible for us.
Yes, I'm glad to. I mean, we can, if we discuss, or if we look, for example, at the guidelines concretely and specifically, the Foreign Office has defined 10 guidelines on how it envisions to implement or for feminist foreign policy, that are important for the German foreign policy being feminist. And of those 10, 4, I think, are actually dedicated to the internal perspective. So that's quite a lot, I would say. And I also think that it's quite necessary, because in comparison to other ministries, the Federal Foreign Office is always the one kind of in at the lower end of the ranks when it comes to representation of women. I mean, it's almost by now almost 50%, so almost gender parity in terms of the looking at the foreign ministry staff overall, but it's only 27%, I think, in the higher ranks. And if you look at the more prestigious ambassadorial postings, the more prestigious postings within the ministry, it becomes slimmer and slimmer. So I think it's really an aspect where we have to, or where the Foreign Office and we as Germany have to kind of make good for some ground that we have lost in the last couple of years. And it's 2023, so feminist foreign policy isn't the only agenda that kind of puts forth a commitment to gender equality. I mean, there are national laws prescribing non-discrimination, but also a commitment to gender equality. And there are also other, for example, the Women, Peace and Security agenda with the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 that was adopted more than 20 years by now. So that also focuses greatly on representation and participation of women. So this is something where we really need to focus on our homework, so to say. And the emphasis on making the Foreign Office more attractive to not only women, but to break up a bit more of the stereotypical roles, to maybe make it more acceptable to be kind of combined with working in the Foreign Office and having a family. I mean, that also includes men, right? So it's also about being able to be a father, work in the Foreign Office, and take over care responsibilities. So those aspects are also very important. And an additional aspect on the internal dimension is also the level of expertise and competencies. So the guidelines also mention, for example, gender trainings, and not only gender, but also awareness trainings in terms of other forms of discrimination or structural barriers. And I think that's something that's really immensely important, because it's not only women who are lacking from the ranks of ambassadors and other posts in the Foreign Office, but also all kinds of other layers of identity that are not represented in a fair manner. And I really do appreciate the level of commitment that the Foreign Office also puts in looking at this internal dimension. And yeah, I think that's going to be extremely important. And the other aspect that you touched upon was kind of how Germany is implementing kind of the external dimension. You mentioned the aspect of gender budgeting. And maybe in looking at the guidelines again, Germany defined 4 instruments, so to say, as kind of instruments on how to implement these guidelines of feminist foreign policy. And mainly them being, I'm going to just look at the guidelines here myself. It's mainstreaming, multipliers, gender budgeting, and monitoring. And of those 4, I think the mainstreaming aspect is one that's really interesting and important, because it includes the commitment to appointing an ambassador for feminist foreign policy, having kind of a high level committee within the Foreign Office observing the implementation of feminist foreign policy to really kind of have this accountability mechanism. It lays out that feminist foreign policy contact points should be defined in every embassy, but also in every department within the ministry, and the trainings that I just mentioned already. And just briefly, with the focal points, for example, I think with the contact points, one of the critical elements is, or maybe we can come to the critics that I have, or to the criticism I have maybe a bit later. But I mean, if you just add on top of the responsibilities that people have, the implementation is going to be difficult. So just pointing it out there, we will have to see how those points are implemented. And looking at multipliers, and then I'm going to make a full stop here, and we can going to let you ask another question. Looking at multipliers is something that also strongly includes the aspect of multilateralism and of feminist foreign policy partner states, but of course also of the multilateral system and of international organizations. And I do think that's a really important aspect to also include in feminist foreign policy, looking at how the multilateral system can and should be used, maybe reformed or made more robust to respond to the challenges that we are facing.
Thank you for that, and I'm glad that you brought in the issue of multilateralism, because that's certainly something that I wanted to ask you about a little bit later as well. But let me maybe fold in a question that one of our viewers has. She writes that she worries about laws that are designed to, quote, protect women, because they basically have the assumption that a woman is inherently vulnerable. And this viewer goes on to ask whether there is an ongoing discussion beyond the concept of feminism, of women, that moves away from this language. And I think that sort of gets at what I was asking before about this sort of more values-oriented foreign policy, or a holistic foreign policy, and maybe other terms that can be used that get at the same thing, right, of individual-oriented foreign policy rather than nation-state foreign policy. Is that something that's being widely discussed?
Well, yes, I think it is something that is being discussed, and it's a deliberate choice in how to frame it then. So, for example, in Germany, and with this foreign minister and ministry, it was a deliberate choice, and it is a deliberate choice to name it feminist foreign policy, to highlight the discrepancies at all levels of representation, realization of rights, and allocation of resources that are very gender specific, and not only gender specific, but also include other aspects of intersectional discrimination. And therefore it's kind of pointing the finger where it hurts to name it feminist foreign policy. Also because many in the discussion of do we have to name it feminist foreign policy? Some of the criticism comes from those who claim to have problems with kind of diverting from the content if we name it feminist foreign policy, but we actually in essence do have a problem with the name tag, not only with the name tag but with the substance, as we can see in the case, I would say, of Sweden. But it's certainly true that it's really important not to portray women as victims or as vulnerable, and to look more broadly at what it means to pursue a feminist foreign policy, in that it is a policy, foreign policy for everybody and for all. And I'm sure that the implementation of the guidelines and of the approach will highlight just that. As I just mentioned earlier, when it comes to, for example, the internal dimension in the Foreign Office, it also needs to showcase that it's beneficial for everybody, including men, and not to be stuck to those roles, right? Or when it comes to internal dimension and the implementation of feminist foreign policy, if we look, for example, at sexual and gender-based violence and conflict, we oftentimes talk about women. We don't talk so much about boys or men who can also be victimized in that kind of context. And that is also a huge blind spot that we really need to address. And pointing out those blind spots through the feminist angle is something that benefits everybody. But I also want to add, there are countries that are pursuing a very progressive foreign policy approach, focusing on, for example, gender equality, focusing on an individual security perspective. Finland, for example, is such a case. They don't call it feminist foreign policy, but they have a very broad and very comprehensive approach. And I mean, it can be done. It's an individual decision in the end.
I mean, it seems to me from what you're saying, from what I've read, that the fundamental idea is, how can one create a more diverse and more inclusive decision-making process that is ultimately more sustainable and addresses sort of more of the challenges that individuals are facing, both at home but also internationally. And so I'd like to maybe make a little bit of a pivot and turn to a couple of countries that have been in the headlines lately, and where we can actually see sort of what a feminist foreign policy might look like in action. As I was going through some articles, I saw that almost exactly a year ago, about a month into the war in Ukraine, which is still going on, you wrote an article together with Cornelius Adaba, who is a good friend of the ACG's and who's watching right now, about what a feminist foreign policy means with regard to the conflict that is unfolding. And I think one of the questions that I have for you related to that is how does a feminist foreign policy sort of fit with the Zeitenwende, right? We've all been talking about the Zeitenwende for a year at this point. It's probably no surprise that the feminist foreign policy was released at that time. But how do you see FFP and Zeitenwende coming together? And then we can talk a little bit about the situation in Ukraine as well.
Yes, and I appreciate your distinction between feminist foreign policy and the Zeitenwende and Ukraine, because often, and understandably so, the discussions become kind of conflated in Germany, and I do think it's important to distinguish. So, I mean, one of the criticisms, maybe one of the questions was, is feminist foreign policy something that we can pursue now, that we see that we really need a tangible reply and response in light of the aggression of Russia? And I think the reply from this feminist perspective would be, yes, we need to respond and to react in this situation, but we also need to be prepared for future security challenges ahead, right? So if we kind of narrow it down, if we narrow our conception and our understanding of security and of threats to this one aspect of certainly very real and very existent Russian aggression that we have to react to, then we lose sight of what we also need to be taking into account on very different layers and levels. As I mentioned, in terms of climate crisis, in terms of global inequalities being drivers of conflict, and to a scope that we can't even imagine now if we don't start doing something about that. So I think it's about time, and it doesn't really have to be only one or the other, but really taking into account both or all of the realities, I think, is something that we really need to do. And maybe also concretely in terms of why do we need feminist foreign policy, especially now? I mean, we already discussed several cases and several examples in which or how feminist foreign policy is this realist approach that allows to address the complexities of realities. But it's also in terms of putting us in a position to respond effectively and adequately, because we need to understand what the individual security threats to every individual and every person, for example, in Ukraine would be, because they differ greatly. And if we don't know the gender-specific or intersectional-specific security needs and risks, then we can't really provide assistance, then we can't provide recovery adequately, we can't provide support for reconstruction, and we can't even provide, for example, armory or equipment, because there we also know that there are great differences in needs, for example, when it comes to military equipment, when you look at men or women. So I mean, it's really at all levels and all layers where such a complex approach just proves that it's really something that we need right now.
And I think one of the things that you're highlighting here too is that, you know, the thinking in terms of a specific case in the short term and in the long term might be very different, right? I mean, the issues that need to be addressed today or tomorrow are one set of issues. The issues that need to be addressed when, for example, Ukraine is undergoing reconstruction are a different set of issues, but one has to keep both sets of issues in mind at the same time. I mean, I think one of the reasons why it's so interesting to talk about Ukraine as a case study is there have been a lot of news reports about obviously the refugees from Ukraine, who have tended to be women and children, largely because males between the age of, I think, 18 and 65 are not allowed to leave, and so they're not leaving, they're staying and fighting. But then there have been a number of articles about women in Ukraine who are staying to fight and are not just working as medics on the front lines, but are actually fighting on the front lines themselves. And so this is a conflict that really is affecting everybody there. You know, how have you seen sort of Germany's position on Ukraine evolve when sort of seen through this lens of feminist foreign policy?
I think, well, that's also a question in terms of feminist foreign policy, but also my personal views, I think, on German foreign policy making, and especially in that case. And I mean, I must say, Germany has responded quickly in those areas where we are more comfortable, so to say, and maybe also more knowledgeable or more used to, let's put it like that. So, for example, the aspects of providing immediate support and immediate assistance in terms of on human rights support, for example, when it comes to the accountability and assistance in cases of sexual and gender-based violence, for example. So this is something where Germany has early on started to provide rape kits for documentation, for example, and has also supported access to safe procedures or safe procedures of abortion in cases of pregnancies resulting from those rapes at a scale. And when we look at, for example, some of the countries who have been first recipients of Ukrainian refugees, where women can't have access to those safe abortions, for example. This is something where I can stress enough how important it also is to be first movers and early providers of help and assistance in those cases. Yet again, I mean, when you look at the military support, or kind of the providing support on the defense scale, I mean, Germany has been moving slowly, and there has been quite a wide debate within German society in terms of not only society, but also kind of the political decision-making circles, and you're all very aware of that. And I think that stems back to really the Zeitenwende and the repositioning. And the fact of adapting to this new reality. And something that I do want to highlight is that within the circles of feminists and activists or experts on feminist foreign policy, there is really a vast majority that has been outspoken from the very beginning, that of course now we need to do what's necessary and provide Ukraine with what's necessary to defend itself against this war of aggression. And I think that's something that also highlights that feminist foreign policy is and can be and should be flexible in adapting to those challenges and situations. And it's not something that is only moralistic and principle-based and very fixed in a certain manner. But of course, in a situation like this, we need to react swiftly. And if we look at what has happened and what is happening, and who is affected and to which extent, we certainly do need to continue like this and maybe move faster in some aspects. And it also depends. I mean, there are lots of forms of feminisms, right? The ultimate goal of feminist foreign policy is also a vision of value-oriented foreign policy, is of course to somehow overcome those structures and those patterns of violence and also of militarized violence. And this is maybe a vision in the very long run and in the very long term. And I do still think it's also a vision that we should not lose sight of, because we kind of need a positive idea to develop towards, otherwise we're not developing. So I think we also need to question, what has brought us to the situation, how we ended up here, what kind of factors did we disregard, and what do we need to work on and continue to kind of overcome those challenges. So for example, with the guidelines and the feminist foreign policy, Germany is also committing to a global zero world in terms of abolishment of nuclear weapons. I mean, the guidelines remain vague in terms of implementation, but it's still in terms of a policy goal. And I think those moves are important to also keep sight of.
So, you know, another, I mean, thank you for all of that, because I think it's really important, the comments that you're making, but another place where I think we have to think about sort of balancing short-term interventions to try to alleviate the suffering of the civilian population and a more long-term approach is Iran. This is a country that you and Cornelius have also written about, and one of our viewers might have anticipated that I wanted to ask you about Iran as well, because she submitted the following questions. She says that while you pointed out that feminist foreign policy has a basis in realism, there also seems to be an emphasis on liberal values. So how would Germany's feminist foreign policy in practice approach the current deterioration of women's rights in Iran? And how would this be balanced with sensitivity to cultural differences?
I think that's an excellent question as well. And it also is an excellent question because it sets the scene from the starting point from which we are implementing feminist foreign policy now, which is a policy in a foreign policy, international diplomacy, focusing very much on power play, focusing very little on human rights and very little on human security for that matter, and very little on women's rights. The fact that we are kind of in the situation is also somehow because, at least from kind of how the European foreign policy approach has been shaped, is that it has overemphasized, for example, the nuclear agreement for decades, not really taking into account the situation of women's rights, not really taking into account the deterioration of women's rights, and also, and something that we haven't discussed so much as of now, is the role of civil society.
Mm-hmm.
Because if we look at how we think foreign policy and how foreign policy is made, civil society also plays a huge role in a feminist foreign policy approach, in that aspect of diverse policy making, in that aspect of really talking to those people who are affected and impacted by the policies that we design and make, and recognizing that those are kind of the experts on their own behalf. And I think this is something that we should make the parameter of our foreign policy making and planning, speaking to those people who are affected by the policies that we do. So in the context of Iran, for example, in every policy decision, we should ask and we should take as point of reference how our actions do actually support and or affect the people protesting and living in Iran. So we kind of need to ask, what's the impact of sanctions, and how are they aiding or hurting and deteriorating the situation for people living in the country? How is international isolation, for example, helping people or hurting people? I'm not implying a black or white response to those questions. It's just that those questions need to be asked and evaluated, and also discussed with civil society as much as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, it's difficult in a context that's as narrow and as closed off as Iran, but it's also something where we can see kind of the faults of our policies in the last decades, because we have under-prioritized the human rights aspect, the civil society support, the sustaining relations with civil society actors, for example, in such a narrow and restrictive space. And we also have to come up with new ideas and new instruments, how to confront those issues, not only in Iran, but also in Iran, mm-hmm. and on Iran, because we increasingly see that authoritarian states are a huge risk to our global security. And maybe that's also circling back to the multilateralism that we discussed. We need to find a response to confront those states, and civil society could also be a huge leverage and a huge angle there. But for that, we need to kind of find instruments and ways to prioritize and a sustained engagement at eye level. And that would also be a response or a way, so to say, to counterbalance cultural differences and to counterbalance cultural sensitivities, because, of course, feminist foreign policy is not about implying or applying something from the outside that is not home in a country or that is not home in a certain context. But also, let me add that, I mean, this revolt and protests and a revolution, if you want to say so, in Iran has been called, and I would agree, is truly a feminist revolution in mm-hmm. the sense it is women-led, it is youth-led, it is very intersectional, so it stretches over all differences and all sorts of different backgrounds of society, be it different class, be it also different origins. I mean, those people who are most affected in the context of the repression of the protests are, for example, those who also keep the mass protests still alive. Those are living in the provinces, in the more peripheral regions of the country. So, Sistan, Baluchistan, Kurdish people, and there we see that this development and this movement and this protest is really feminist in its intersectionality. So it can also be really inspiring to see that a feminist approach is not only something that is kind of implemented from the outside, but that it's really grassroots in that case.
And I think, as we're sort of running out of time, I think we should have another conversation about just Iran in this context, and about civil society, because I think that would be very interesting for people to hear about. But I do want to try to squeeze in two more viewer questions that bring in the transatlantic dimension, if you will. One of our viewers is curious whether there's a way to make this concept of feminist foreign policy more accessible or anschlussfähig for the US debate. And in a similar vein, another one of our viewers wonders whether Germany can serve as a role model for gender equity and gender rights in the United States. I'd be curious to sort of hear your thoughts about both of those questions.
Yes, great questions, I would say. There is a debate in the US also going on feminist foreign policy. I mean, there are certain papers and certain discussions also in the Senate, I think. So, I mean, it's not something completely new to the US debate, neither. The question of how to make it maybe more accessible or anschlussfähig, as you mentioned, that might be something that circles back to maybe putting the finger where it hurts. If you look at the disputed state of bodily autonomy, if you look at the disputed state of rights of minorities or the security of marginalized, not minorities, but marginalized groups. So I think it's a question of how maybe then at a domestic discussion would want to define such an approach for itself. But I think that it would be certainly something of great value, and especially when we look at maybe Germany being a role model, or maybe not, if not a role model, maybe one of the drivers now behind foreign policy, and also behind the aspect of multipliers as being put forth in the guidelines. I think there is certainly kind of an entry point. As, for example, Biden had his commitment to kind of the Summit of Democracies in terms of how to confront the crisis of multilateralism. What can we do there? And I mean, one of the ideas was exactly that. Maybe something like Friends of Feminist Foreign Policy can also be a different angle to that. And I mean, there is this kind of group of states pursuing or being friendly with a feminist foreign policy approach, meeting regularly at different multilateral fora. And I think something like that as an informal group can certainly kind of build traction to expand the approach. And as we discussed earlier, it doesn't have to be called feminist foreign policy if it's about the substance. I do like that it is called feminist foreign policy because I think it's important, but it's an individual decision in the end. And I also think that you can discuss and adapt and pursue feminist foreign policy if you're not there yet. I mean, Germany is far from there yet in terms of being the perfect role model. So talking about reproductive rights, talking about the right to abortion, for example, that's something that in Germany, I mean, it's the discussion of abolishment of the paragraph that's penalizing abortion is still so, I mean, maybe Germany could be a role model in the sense that you don't need to be perfect and there yet to make an emphasis that you want to get there. And I think that's something that's also necessary to look at if you're discussing feminist foreign policy, because basically no state is there yet.
Yeah.
But
and I think making the argument that this is relevant and that being inclusive ultimately benefits everybody is sort of one of the ways to go. As we wrap up, and you sort of left an opening for this earlier in our conversation, and you just said Germany's not there yet, and yet Germany has made a number of advances. I think I'd be interested in hearing from you where you think German feminist foreign policy falls short at the moment. I mean, obviously this is new. It's important. The guidelines have been set out, but do you think that the guidelines could have been more aspirational in some ways?
So I do think that it's a huge step. I mean, for feminist foreign policy to be launched at the Foreign Office, to hear the Foreign Office talk about gender budgeting, I mean, which is not a revolutionary concept. Humanitarian assistance and aid has been doing that for a long time, but in that context is revolutionary. and in the manner it's implemented. So I don't want to kind of take anything away from that being an important step. But yeah, I do think there are some aspects and elements where it maybe could have been a bit more ambitious, not in terms of because I think it's falling short, but just my personal views on that. So, for example, on substance, just a few remarks. So, I mean, what I do think is positive is that in many cases of the text, it refers to women and marginalized groups in many contexts, and it also highlights and refers to, for example, the LGBTQ community. So I do think it is there. But for example, especially at the beginning, when you talk about goals and about the rights, representation, and resources, when you talk about rights, it's the rights of women and girls at that level. So I think there it's really important to highlight it's the rights of everybody, and not only women and marginalized groups, but also men and everybody. That maybe brings me to the second point, where I think could be a bit more comprehensive and a bit more visionary, also looking at the role of masculinities. So in a positive and in a negative way. In a positive way in terms of, for example, when you look at care aspects of care work, for example, when you look at making the Foreign Office attractive to families, it's not about getting women in there, but it's also about changing realities for men in the Foreign Office. And I think that's really important to look into. And it's also, we certainly need to empower women, but women are very powerful. So, I mean, we do need to change the system, and we do need to change masculinities to make that happen. And we do need to engage men, and things have to change. So I mean, that's something that it's in there a lot. But yeah, maybe let's put it like that. And then there are some things about the implementation where I think discussions like those will help to kind of follow up with the accountability and kind of monitor and really look how the implementation is going.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think you just sort of summed it up very well. I mean, this is obviously an important step, but there are a number of further steps that lie ahead that need to be taken as well. And so it's important to recognize it. And I certainly want to thank you for helping us and our viewers understand it and get a better sense of what the feminist foreign policy means. But this has been a really wonderful discussion. And so, Barbara, herzlichen Dank nach Berlin. This has been wonderful. I really enjoyed our conversation and very much appreciate your taking the time to talk with us.
Thank you very much for having me, and to everybody who zoomed in. And it's been great being here with you. Thank you.